Okay, good evening. Welcome and thanks for joining us for tonight's presentation of Watershed Plan options in Pennsylvania. We have a lot of valuable content to share, so I'll move on and highlighting a few webinar details. The webinar is being recorded and it will be available for future views on our YouTube channel and will also be linked through the Conservation District website. You'll receive a follow-up email tomorrow with resources referenced in tonight's webinar, and I will also include a link to the recording. Please feel free to type questions into the chat box at any time, and we will address questions at the end of the presentation. Lastly, I'd like to acknowledge our sponsor. We are able to present on watershed planning tonight with financial support from the PA Association of Conservation Districts through funds distributed by the PA Department of Environmental Protection under Section 319 of the Clean Water Act, which is administered through the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency. We are very excited to present information on different watershed planning options. As you can see, just this handful of bullets demonstrates the powerful utility of watershed plans, achieving objectives in a more efficient and effective manner, generating partner support, unlocking grant funding, incorporating the needs of each unique watershed, and beyond. Please keep in mind that the presenters are providing a summary overview of each of the plans. And we hope that this presentation serves as a launching pad for developing a greater understanding of each option for you to investigate further. I'm so grateful and excited for tonight's presenters. Allison, Amy, and Annie really know what they're talking about. They've written the grant applications, implemented the grants, and understand the value of having a plan for a watershed. Allison is the Senior Director of Community Conservation and Resiliency with the Allegheny Land Trust. She has over 21 years of combined work experience in various roles with the military and private sector. Allison is the lead on land use research projects, new resiliency efforts like carbon credits, non-traditional conservation efforts of community garden preservation, green infrastructure, and other urban greening efforts, and develops and presents content on these topics. Allison also leads ALT's conservation planning efforts and led the creation of the Big Squeaky Creek Watershed Rivers Conservation and Stewardship Plan, which was finalized in 2020. Amy has been the watershed specialist at the Allegheny County Conservation District for the past 13 years. Her work there has centered around all things watershed, including several watershed planning efforts, stream restoration projects, abandoned mine reclamation, watershed education, and water quality monitoring. And Annie is formally trained in environmental science, resource management, political science, and conservation biology. She has worked for huge industrial factories for both state and federal environmental protection agencies on a boat touching bugs, and most recently in leadership positions at nonprofit organizations. Her role running the Jacobs Creek Watershed Association was the most fun that she ever had. Now she's appointed and employed to look at those same watershed issues from the municipal, state, and national level. So we'll lead right into Annie. I will stop share.
Hello, everyone. As Rebecca said, I'm Annie Quinn. Let me just get my PowerPoint up so that it looks as though we are ready to rock and roll. Yes, I am a watershed enthusiast, and just as an FYI, if any of you know me in my professional context and where I work currently, tonight I'm just me, just plain old Annie Quinn, representing watershed enthusiasts everywhere, right? So I'm excited to talk to you about some of the experiences I've had that actually cross the barriers of all the positions that I have worked at in my love and enthusiasm for watersheds. So I often am at a public event like this or other public events, and the question I always start with is the very basis of what we're going to talk about, right? And that's to say, what is a watershed? Now, the cool thing is that my really good friend and colleague, Amy, is going to actually go into that in a bit. But I want to tell you a little bit about what the public normally says when I ask this question. When I normally talk about a watershed, instead of giving me a couple different answers that may be parts and pieces of a water cycle or parts and pieces of how we have water flow across our land, the most common answer that they give me is that it's a building filled with water. And that's actually a really good analysis because you're taking the word, breaking it down into its parts. I think that English teachers would be proud, right? You're saying, if I don't know a word, how do I figure it out? So there's this conception that, you know, is a watershed, a physical shed full of water. And I actually tonight, to kick off our presentation, I am the hype man for discussing watersheds, literally, because I would like to show you some opportunities and what is possible when we talk about watershed planning. So keeping that idea that it's a building filled with water in mind as our definition for the word watershed, I want to talk a little bit about watershed plans. And that's a tricky business because watershed plans are an incredibly siloed thing. Because of numerous factors that I'll talk about, water has been almost delegated into individual pots. And those individual silos, those individual watersheds have resulted in water being managed very individually. And across a lot of our planning techniques and watersheds historically, we've looked at, for instance, when you flush your toilet, that water is a very specific type of water that's classified as a specific type of water, that's regulated as a specific type of water, that is allowing us to then figure out how we fix and solve the problems of that specific area of water, but sometimes maybe not taking into consideration the other aspects. And so on this elaborate slide, my goal was to just say that between water quality and swimming and flooding and riparian buffers and emergency hazard mitigation and oil and gas development, and when you have lead in your drinking water, every single one of those issues historically has been very siloed in our water resources management techniques. And so when we have people answer that a watershed is a building full of water, that's actually how a lot of us are actively planning and negotiating how we move forward with what we do with that water once we have it. And so the goal for me as the kickoff of this presentation is to provide what is possible, what we could do instead as we move forward in water resources planning. And then I'm really excited to show you some of the best examples of how we're trying to eat away at that process and knock down as many of the silos as we can and pick and choose which silos we can really combine right now to do the best we can in planning. So as a watershed manager, one of the things I was in charge of a creek out in Fayette in Westmoreland County. And so I knew about all these silos. That's the tricky bit. If you're in a watershed association, it's not that you silo the water, it's the water's been siloed about how you are handling everything. But when you're sitting down and being like, I need a grant to solve this, you have all of these silos running through your head. And then on top of that, you have all of these things running through your head. There wasn't a single day that I wasn't actively planning and building an activity for my watershed that I wasn't thinking about almost every single thing you see here, right? So what's happening in my watershed across the locks, the dams, the temperature, the parks, the CSOs, the SSOs, the soils, the culverts, the erosion, the abandoned wells, the abandoned mine drainage, the climate change, the dredging, how much litter is getting in my watershed? Are the macros okay? What happens when it floods? What am I gonna do about my floodplains? Is there any research being done about how macros respond to different types of pollution techniques? Yes, but is that changing? Is it evolving? You know, so this is a very cluttered mind map of all of the ways that even beyond the silos of water, when we're planning water, we need to have almost this list in our head checking off as we move forward in evaluating the best way forward to say, how am I making sure that I'm looking at my ecosystem services while I'm evaluating my CSOs, while I'm evaluating my stream temperature, while I'm understanding the effects of acid rain on my soils, right? And that is a very high bar. That is a big task. I'm not asking for something easy. In fact, that's why it's so complicated. And that's why there's only been bits and pieces of integrated water resources planning so far. And then I also just want to emphasize the idea that not only have we siloed water, we've also siloed water's effects on the environment, right? So one of the maps I wanted to add on top of this was the amount of degraded streams in our region. You know, so it's state of Pennsylvania, 85,000 streams. Of those, a phenomenal percentage are impaired, which means that they're polluted in a way that they're not helping us let them be fishable or drinkable or swimmable, right? And then on top of that, you have this environmental justice map where we're affecting specific people in specific neighborhoods to a greater extent, whether that's race or class or their ability to be low income individuals. These siloed effects are also causing damaging ramifications to our region. So just why did all this siloing happen? I just want to show you how complicated this is. So if you were to say, okay, I'm going to grab a couple samples and make sure they're in my next plan. I'm just going to take a look at what laws are regulated. So just going on the federal level, right? Well, you have drinking water, and drinking water is regulated by the Safe Drinking Water Act. But if you want to talk stormwater, stormwater is regulated by the National Pollutant Discharge Elimination System, short NPDES, right? But then if you want to talk wastewater, wastewater is more directly in the Clean Water Act, and it's in that NPDES permitting, but it's actually a different aspect that is usually handled by a complete separate department within the EPA. And then you have groundwater, and groundwater is a silly thing because at the federal level, there's some regulations, but the state hasn't really adopted those. And so you have the groundwater regulations. But then if you want to say, well, that's not even all those silos you showed us, Ann. So then if you minimize those silos and you add on top, you're like, well, what about lakes and streams? And how are those being regulated? Well, there's a section of the Clean Water Act that's specifically for those. But what if your lake and stream open up to a broader area of wetland? Well, that's regulated by a different area of the Clean Water Act, and they have their own lists. But then you can't really point at the pollution that you're worried about. We call that non-point source pollution. And that's regulated by a similar program, but by a different grant program, by a different regulation. It has a different plan that you would use in your watershed to get funding for that type of source. Whereas the funding you might get for wetlands, lakes, and streams might be in a different area in the EPA or DEP. And then on top of that, well, what if you're really concerned about a mine that's going in your watershed? Well, that's regulated through the Clean Water Act, but there's actually a completely different department that's entirely responsible for how you would manage that. And then if you said, well, okay, it's not mining, but my waters are impaired, well, that's the 303D list of the Clean Water Act. And that's a separate area of the same act that's creating a different department within the waters that are regulated. And then you're like, well, how are we going to fix the streams that are broken? Well, that's a TMDL. Right? And a TMDL is a total maximum daily load. And so the whole point of this is just to show you that this siloing is incredibly entrenched in our system, is so entrenched. The siloing is hard to break out of. And then you add, I was clearly having fun. This is like, even if you went to the state level, right? And you're like, I just want to talk to the one person that helps me understand water at the state. Wrong. That does not exist because there are so many different people at the state that handle water. We have different, if you're talking about stormwater in a municipality, well, if that municipality has combined sewers, they're one way. If they have separate sewers, they're a different permit. So I'm talking very fast because the whole point of all these messy slides is to say that water is incredibly siloed, almost not necessarily on purpose, but that's the way in which we were able to slowly start to take the Clean Water Act and make it real, right? Because that act says that our job is to create waters of the US to be safe, to be swimmable, to be drinkable, and to be fishable. Well, that is a huge task, right? And we did it in the 70s. So it wasn't like we were doing it before we had already caused damage. So I'm not saying that this system is wrong. What I'm saying is it's coming down to us, the watershed managers of the world, to break these silos and understand the connections and start working across these different departments of our regulatory structure. So when I first started at the job I have now, it was really hard for me to understand who all the players were and who are all the people and who manages water. And so this is a personal project that I did. I built a mind map. This is every individual that I could find in, give or take, Allegheny County with of course, I love watershed groups. So I built out to a lot of the Ohio River Basin, maybe the Southwest PA version that shows how many different, so every single person on this mind map, I know you can't read the titles, but every single entity you see here, they deal with water. They actively sometimes are educating or regulating or managing or discussing or putting in a pipe or taking out of a pipe or doing a research paper about macros or hosting a litter cleanup campaign that's along a stream bed. That's how complicated the spaghetti is of the partnerships of our watershed management, our watershed, right? That's siloed, aspect. And the good news is a lot of these groups are working hard now to identify how we can move away from those silos and towards what the terminology is for where I would like us all to head, right? And that's integrated water resources management, right? So if we take the UN definition of integrated water resource management, it's the process which promotes the coordination and development and management of water, land, and the related resources in order to maximize the resultant economic and social welfare in an equitable manner without compromising the sustainability of vital ecosystems. That's a lot. But what they're saying is how can, and the lower definition from the American Water Resources Association, where they're talking about how can we take our plans, our development, our protection, our management, and have it involve. And we know that water and land interact so much, and the land affects the water and the water affects the land. And how can we have those related resources be fostered in a plan that has sustainable economic activity? So we're not also asking us as humans to no longer be capable of sustaining a society, a version of our society, but how can we live in equilibrium with the ecosystems that surround us so that public health is not affected by the environment, we have protections, and at the same time, we're protecting those ecosystems, right? So integrated water resources management is what I consider the goal we should always all be headed to. And so I wanted to start the presentation today, and then excited to hand it off to some of my friends to talk about how they've bitten off bits and pieces of those silos and how they've grabbed as many of the different parts of water as they could, as we know how to right now, to try to achieve this goal. And one of the things I just want to make sure you know is that there's actually a terminal. Integrated water resources management is actually a part of this larger, bigger process. It's called the One Water approach. And they love circles. So if anyone, logos, you'll see lots of circles involved here. But so the idea that this One Water approach is where you're taking rainwater, surface water, groundwater, recycled water, drinking water, wastewater, and you're thinking about them all as equally valued. And you're saying, I want to have a reliable and resilient water utility, a thriving city, competitive businesses, sustainable agriculture, social and economic inclusion, and healthy waterways. And so this is the ideal that I just want to share today. And there are some really great examples of that. So for instance, the Integrated Water Resources Plan that was just announced in a press release by Pittsburgh Water and Sewer Authority in cooperation with Watersheds of South Pittsburgh, the Sawmill Run, right? So a stream that runs up the South Hills along Route 51 of Pittsburgh. It involves 12 municipalities. So here's a key word, lots of intergovernmental interaction, right? Along a watershed instead of along a municipal boundary. You have a whole bunch of different people that are involved, including different types of government agencies. And their job is to look at this and take away, they even say right in the plan, break down the silos and take a watershed-wide approach that solves multiple water issues while fostering development, public health, and beautifying their neighborhoods, right? So I include links in the PowerPoint, and I believe these will be shared. I hope you'll check out some of these, the beginning efforts of us trying to have integrated water resources management in our region. Another great example is the Southwest Pennsylvania Commission. They have a water resources center. They have built a website where they are trying to provide the resources so that you can go out and be the integrated water resources planner of your dreams, right? And I love it because you can search by watershed and they can show you all of the plans that have already been written, right? And you can see that some of them are very siloed and some of them have a little bit of components for this and a little bit of components for that. And now we can start to look at these plans overall for a single watershed and start to identify innovative approaches that cross the boundaries of those types of water. How can we look for different types of change that can be powerful across intergovernmental relationships? How can we have a healthy waterway, but also have multi-benefit outcomes to all of our citizens along that watershed? So I recommend checking out their integrated water resources planning page. I recommend checking out all of the plans that may be in your watershed right now and start doing almost a peer review. What has already been written and how can we start to create that de-siloing effect? And then the Pittsburgh Parks Commission has the watershed task forces, and they're really in that building of the the ground basis for the partnerships that allow us to break down silos, right? So they have a focus in the city of Pittsburgh, 4 Mile Run, Heth's Run, Soho, 21st Street, Woods Run, and Negley Run. And these task forces have partners from across the different agencies that may not have historically sat in a room and talked specifically about water, but making that water be the focus and allowing us to think about it from the one water perspective. And then in reference to another example within that, the Negley Run Task Force is one of the best I've ever seen. It was actually started by artists. Talk about a silo breaking, right? As you start talking about neighborhood, very ground level efforts that involve the true individuals living within a neighborhood, and how can they advocate for the change that is necessary for them to be successful in an urban ecosystem, right? And looking at it as a nature-based biodiversity, ecological function, stormwater management plan that is actively breaking silos across an entire region. And in this one, it's because they're hoping to solve flooding issues. They're hoping to also beautify and make their neighborhoods welcoming and wonderful places, right? So another example of breaking as many silos as we know how to right now. And then another really amazing example that's one of my favorites is that there's a really innovative approach that upstream Pittsburgh, they used to be 9 Mile Run Watershed Association, has taken, where they did a integrated water resource plan for their 9 Mile Run. But for them, they also took into consideration public health, social vulnerability, environmental quality, and urban landscape. These types of this is the first time I've ever seen this together in one place, where we're actively looking at asthma and diabetes and social vulnerability and household composition and disabilities and minority status and language. And we're also saying, how can we make sure that when we're doing a project, we're taking these inclusionary factors into consideration? It's inspiring. And I really hope you'll check it out, because it's a way that we can start to really break down the silos of that impact that we've had on specific communities. And the cool thing is now they'll move forward with the knowledge of where and how to place their green infrastructure in a really thoughtful way. And then Pittsburgh Water and Sewer Authority right now, they're talking integrated, right? So they're about to kick off this brand new stormwater strategic planning process. They've been doing background meetings. They've been hoping and discussing how they'll move forward. And they're using some language that excites me, right? They're saying the word climate change and talking about community input. They're talking about prioritizing public health and wellness, cost-effective, inclusive, sustainable. These are the words we want to see when we start talking about the silo breaking necessary to move forward as a region. And through this plan, they're hoping to address flooding, but also quality of life, but also stormwater. And they're also hoping to have an incredibly broad stakeholder support for that plan. So this is an example of how we're seeing this slowly start to ingle into our society here in Pittsburgh. And we're seeing these plans that are definitely grabbing and working towards as best of an integrated approach as we know how to right now. And then I just want to bring up one that I'm actively involved with. I was elected to this national organization that's discussing how we can start to have an integrated water resources plan, a restoration plan for the entire Ohio River Basin, right? And they are doing that by having and meeting some of those silos, right? So they're talking about how do we talk about ecosystem services, restoring the river, but also flooding. How do we also talk about the importance of clean water for fish and wildlife and businesses? You can't make, rye whiskey without clean water. How do you have a recreational tourism industry that's literally fueling river cities, is the new term that we use when we're talking about economic development in our communities? What about the commerce and how the Ohio River is one of the most used rivers for floating transportation in our country? And then also, how can we make sure we're educating and researching along the huge amount of universities across that region, right? That's an integrated approach. These are examples of people grabbing onto the one water and integrated water resources management techniques and utilizing them. And so as we move forward and you listen to Amy and Allison today, I want you to listen for these key topics, because they are the leaders in your region actively trying to make sure that these components are grabbed as best as possible. And then as you move forward, I hope you consider diverse partnerships with many organizations. Cross that spaghetti, find as many spaghetti partners as you can, right? share and cost funding innovations, professional collaboration and expertise. There are people that have very niche specialties, I would say me included, right? And we can provide a very specific access to breaking down 1 or 2 silos, and then invite a whole bunch of other people that can break down their own silos to help. And then centering environmental justice, equity, and inclusion as a focus and priority in all of our plans, having public engagement and education built in and consistent, and then looking at a watershed across intergovernmental boundaries, acknowledging that climate change is real and happening, and we have sustainable options that we can do to make sure that we can survive moving forward, and then eliminating those water silos as best as we're able. Because I really do believe our economy, our people, our society, and our ecology can thrive. And that's really the basis of the integrated watershed approach. And I will now, I guess I will throw up. This is my contact information. Like I said, I'm here as just me today. Here are some things that I do and places that I sit. You're welcome to email me, call me, and I'd love to talk more about this. But more importantly, I'm going to stop sharing and I'm going to pass this over to my good friend Amy Miller at the Conservation District, who has been working on figuring out how to break silos across the board for 13 years. So take it away, Amy.
All right, thank you, Annie. Yeah, just let me get my presentation up. Annie mentioned I am the watershed specialist for the Allegheny County Conservation District. And tonight I'm going to be talking more about traditional watershed plans and how we've kind of started breaking down those silos. Annie has very enthusiastically told us about where we're going, and I think the future of what watershed planning can and will be in the future, which is looking really good. So just a little outline of what I'm going to talk about, and that is starting off with watershed assessments and watershed implementation plans, and we'll go through an example that we did for the Montour Run watershed. This plan provides an example of a traditional watershed assessment. It does have a lot of the components that go into a watershed implementation plan, but it hasn't gone through the formal adoption process that a watershed implementation plan has to with the EPA. So we'll talk about visual watershed assessments, and then I'll provide some kind of helpful hints in how you might choose a watershed plan that's right for you if you're thinking about that. So first, as Annie mentioned, we're going to talk about watersheds, not the building full of water, but the more traditional definition that we like to use in watersheds. And you can see in the diagram, we have this landscape with mountains and hills along the outside. And when it rains or snows, all the runoff flows down those slopes toward a single water body in the center. I always do this because I think it's important to recognize that we're not just talking about the stream or the body of water when we're talking about watersheds and watershed planning. We're talking about the entire landscape, whether that's forest or residential subdivision or agricultural land or roads or commercial developments. All of it's part of the watershed and ultimately affects our streams. And not just our local streams, but it affects, you know, in our area, the Ohio River and then the Mississippi River and so on. So I show this picture. This is actually the mouth of Montour Run. You can see the sediment plume there that goes into the Ohio River. So it's one way that the Montour Run watershed is impacting the Ohio River. So let's get into watershed plans. So a watershed assessment versus a watershed implementation plan. They're both scientific studies that evaluate the conditions of a watershed. The biggest difference between the two is that a watershed implementation plan, or a WIP as they're commonly referred as, address a specific pollutant load known as a total maximum daily load. A total maximum daily load is the maximum amount of a pollutant that can enter a a water body so that the water body can still meet the water quality standards that EPA sets. The EPA provides guidance on what needs to be included in a WIP, and they ultimately approve that plan at the end. It can become a legal document with TMDL requirements. The benefit of a WIP is that it opens up additional funding sources to implement your project. So you can then access EPA's 319 program funds, which are only eligible to about 40 other watersheds across the state. Versus a watershed assessment, they typically look at a combination of water quality, biology, macroinvertebrates, and stream conditions. And the benefit of this plan is that the work can be completed, the assessment work itself can be completed with volunteers that have had some training. It can be completed often in a more timely manner, and it's often less expensive than other plans. So we're going to take a look at a watershed assessment that ACCD recently completed in 2020, the Monterey Run Watershed Assessment and Implementation Plan. This watershed is approximately 37 square miles, encompasses parts of 5 municipalities. For our watershed assessment, we divided the watershed into 6 sub-watersheds that are shown by the different colors there on the map. The plan initiative was led by ACCD with assistance from several watershed stakeholders, again, breaking down those silos. And we had a consultant help us, Ethos Collaborative, helped us out putting the plan together. The plan was funded through the Growing Greener program for about $94,000 in grant funding and an additional 15% match on top of that, which is required by the grant. So as you get started, as with most plans, you got to start with what you know about the watershed. So that includes gathering any past plans that might exist, which could include watershed plans or natural heritage or county inventories, county comprehensive plans, Act 167 stormwater management plans. Maybe the municipalities have their own planning documents. So you want to know what all these pieces can help shape what we know and where we want to go moving forward. So you also need to do an assessment of the current conditions of the stream. It usually involves looking at what the stream is impaired for, what are its issues, where are there areas you should be focusing your efforts, be it conservation or remediation. This is where most of the assessment portion falls. And then you also want to identify what do you want to accomplish. It seems like a no-brainer, right? But as Annie mentioned, things can get complicated pretty quickly. So it's often a wise idea to break it into smaller, more achievable chunks and planning out different action steps to reach your overall goal. So to discover the current conditions in Monterey Run, we used 4 methods for assessing the watershed. We looked at water quality, macroinvertebrates in fish. We did some GIS modeling, and we conducted a visual assessment. For the water quality monitoring, and any monitoring site that you're going to use as a baseline, you want to make sure to choose those sites so that you can often get to them easily. You're going to be going back to them and referring to them often. So they should be relatively easily accessible, but located where it makes sense for your watershed. So maybe above or below a tributary or a project area that you might be thinking about. For their GIS modeling, so probably require a consultant to do. It did for us. So they looked at how pollutants accumulate as water flows across the landscape and towards the stream. And this was a helpful tool for us because it helped us look at the entire watershed really, and not just the stream. And also allowed us to look at areas that we may not have been able to access physically. So we might not have had permission, or we just couldn't get there. And then finally, we talked about visual stream assessments. A visual stream assessment is exactly what it sounds like. It's walking the creek to know and evaluate various aspects of the stream and the immediate landscape surrounding the stream. So we looked at stream characteristics like what's the riparian area look like, what are the stream banks, what's it composed of, what's there for habitat for macroinvertebrates or fish. There are 12 characteristics in all that we looked at on a scale of 1 to 10. 10 is the best score, 1 is the lowest score. And then the individual scores for each category are averaged to give you kind of a ranking for each reach that you evaluated. So in our mantra run example, you can see we walked the entire length of the main stem and then several tributaries. And this map shows those average scores. So red being poor, yellow being fair, and green being good. The visual assessment, I like it because it can be performed on its own, and it can actually stand as the starting point for your watershed plan. There are a couple of groups that have completed visual assessments for their watershed, and that became their plan and provided their next steps. And then there's also, they can be completed by trained volunteers, provides an accurate snapshot. It's also can be a little less expensive because you don't have quite the data analysis that some of the other plans can require. And it's also can be done fairly quickly. But some of the drawbacks, it may not give you the level of detail you're looking for. And it also requires access and landowner permission to be in the stream. And watershed groups have done that in various ways, from sending out mailers to talking to people to get permission. So once you collected all your data, that's kind of the easy part. Then you got to figure out what to do with it and what you want your plan to be for the future. So we, in the mantra run, we looked at we prioritized our projects based on property ownership. So we looked for larger landowners next to the stream, and then we used our GIS data to help us see where we would get the most benefit for those projects. And now we are kind of at the implementation phase, and our first project is going to be at the Findlay Township Activity Center. If you're familiar with that, we'll be installing a rain garden and bioswale there in the near future. And we like the site because not only was it good for pollution reduction, but it also provides a good area where people are going to be able to see it and maybe think about how they can incorporate some of the BMPs in their own activity or property or whatnot. And then finally, I just wanted to offer some tips on what I found helpful in working through the watershed planning process. And a big one is consider your watershed size. The Montour Run watershed is 37 square miles, which is very large. So that's why the plan got broken down into sub-watersheds. So we have more manageable pieces that you can show progress, and that keeps both your stakeholders and your funders interested in your projects. Second, you want to know your available resources and identify who needs to be as part of this process early. So break down those silos. This can include state and federal agencies like the Army Corps, DEP, or Fish and Boat, your local municipalities. You want to make sure that the municipalities are involved in whatever you're doing. any other conservation groups or land trusts in the area. And you want to keep the citizens involved so they know what's happening in their own backyards. Creating achievable goals is important. I talked about that before. Goals can be broken down into action steps that don't seem so daunting. Because if you just tell them we're going to clean up this entire stream and do all of this work, it can seem a little too much, and then people can get frustrated and not try. And finally, having someone with experience helps. So anyone from a consultant who does this professionally to just a volunteer who's participated in a different, watershed planning process. At the Conservation District, we're also here to help. And look at example plans from other watersheds. Annie showed Southwest PA Commission's website. We also have many of the watershed plans from Allegheny County and on our website. So take a look at the different types of plans out there and see what might work best for your watershed. So that concludes my portion. And up next is Allison, and she's going to talk about DCNR Rivers Conservation Plan. So I will stop share and let you take it away, Allison.
Okay, thank you. And there's a lot of nice tie-ins to what Amy was just discussing with my material, especially my example of the Big Swickley Creek watershed, because in 2010, the only plan, or there was a watershed assessment plan done in 2010. So they walked the creek, they looked for structural issues, and it was really the jumping off point for Allegheny Land Trust, right? We're a land trust, we're not a water trust. So why is a land trust doing a watershed plan? I'm going to cover that a little bit, but my experience, I was the project manager for our Big Swickley Creek plan. So we did have consultants helping us out, and I'll talk a little bit about that. But similar to the size of the Monterey watershed, Big Swickley Creek is 30 square miles, so just a little bit smaller. We only have 5 subwatersheds in Big Swickley Creek, which is right on the border of 3 counties. So Allegheny and Beaver County, it forms the northwest corner and splits almost right down the middle. And just a teeny little part up in Butler County and Cranberry Township. So you can imagine just municipal coordination and other things is a challenge here, because now we're not just splitting municipalities, we were splitting counties with our effort. And so that's the experience that I would speak from. The plan is on our website, and I'm not going to over-reference it, but I'm always happy to answer questions. So what's a rivers conservation plan, and how is this different from what we've been talking about? So rivers conservation plans are actually sponsored by DCNR. They are much more heavily conservation focused and less trying to address a specific like Clean Water Act or water issue. And as Amy pointed out, a watershed is the water and the land together. And so rivers conservation plans really want you to look at both of those elements very specifically. And it also is just a waterway enhancement program. So if you want to work on something that can be, not always, but can be a little less technical and just on water quality, and look at things like, I saw someone mention, habitat riparian corridors and the different land uses in the watershed. This plan leans more towards those activities, and may be more appropriate if that's what you're looking for. So you will apply to DCNR for this. This is the most up-to-date map available. If you notice, blue is where a plan is in place on this map, and then green is where there isn't. So, if you go to the Southwest PA Watershed Plans site, they have all of these available, and we've sent our plan in as it was finished. So if you go to that site, you're going to see the same information and be able to pull the same reports. Just wanted to show the coverage here, because if you put the coverage maps of all the watersheds in one place, you're going to see a very patchy plan coverage, not just in rural areas, but really right in the middle of Allegheny County. We don't have great coverage in watershed planning. And the other thing is, many state agencies and the 319 plans and a lot of the other plans, if you have a plan registered with the state agencies, it is required to be reviewed before certain types of actions. So we're finishing up still a little bit of getting our plan up into the Rivers Registry, but you know, we have recommendations, we have other things, and the plan is in place. And so it just adds that little check mark or checkbox to certain actions that can incur, you know, or permitted activities. So it's just another piece of information and another way to make sure that everyone is on the same page for your watershed. So this is going back to our experience and just some things to know if you want to think about this plan. You must apply through DCNR's grant portal. It is called a Rivers Conservation Plan grant. And so there's grant and there's actually implementation money, and they tie very closely together. So if you're not familiar with DCNR's portal, you may want to reach out or find like a nonprofit partner or someone with a little bit experience, because these can be somewhat cumbersome applications. Next is, I think you heard Amy mention a 15% match. DCNR is a 50% match. Now that can be a combination of actually, you know, cash in hand or cash in the bank and donated what's called in-kind time. So if you have experts that are helping you and you are not paying them, that's donated in-kind time. Amy was an in-kind, you know, consultant and donation person for our plan. So that's why it's a great tie-in here. But 50% match can be really a lot to think about, and it requires a lot of forethought to make sure that you can get to that match and receive all of the money that you're expecting in your planning effort. You can apply before you have all the match in hand. So there's a little caveat there, but DCNR wants you to have a plan in place for raising those funds, and to be able to demonstrate, you do put forward a draft budget, you know, an initial budget where you could lay those things out. But again, you have to have that balance, and you can show a combination of these things. One of the other things, and I have a slide that shows this, but this process actually takes upwards of 2.5 years to complete. So this isn't like a 6-month, you know, and you can be done sort of planning effort. The amount of information they want you to cover for this plan really cannot be done in a year unless you have everyone just lined up and ready to go as soon as they say you can get started. And DCNR does give you a plan outline where they have like the minimum things that they want you to address and talk about in a handful of topics. And so, but still related, to make sure your plan is relevant and specific to your watershed and where you are, what is unique and good about your watershed. So in Big Sewickley Creek, there's a heron rookery that's been there for a very long time. It's popular with the residents. If you drive up Big Sewickley Creek Road, often you'll actually see a heron fishing in the creek just as you're going by. And so that's something they wanted us to make sure that we took a look at in our plan. And, you know, special other fish, birds, plants. Is this a trout stock stream? We did a lot of emphasis around recreation and trout stocking in our study as well, because it's a very popular activity for the creek. But there's some issues that the creek is starting to face that threaten trout stocking in the future. And those issues for us in summer, the creek dries up completely now. The main branch, if it's drought for, you know, a month, which we've been experiencing quite a bit lately, if you don't have water continuously running, it can affect your macroinvertebrates, which feed the fish, and so on and so forth. So it's a very threatening condition if recreation is a popular activity. But as Amy was just talking about, that visual assessment, you know, where is the creek starting to scour out? Are there little bridges that it's, you know, starting to cut around? It really is a great place to start. And we read that watershed assessment multiple times before we got going with our plan, because it identified some pretty significant issues that we wanted to make sure we took a look at, even though it was 10 years later. There weren't a ton of changes in the watershed, so we were able to kind of use that as a base reference for ourselves. Here's the example project timeline. And Rebecca is going to send out a link to this document. So I know some of the font may be a little small for you to read right now, but DCNR provides this as a PDF, and so we'll make sure you get that link. But if we were to start this year on a plan, spring of 2022, DCNR announces grant awards in the fall. And so you wouldn't even hear about your plan and whether your grant application was successful for 6+ months. And then the next few months are really getting ready to go, getting more in detail. Who's your group of consultants? Who's your partners that you're working with? Have you refined your budget? Have you raised any money? And that takes a few months as well. So if you see my dates, we're walking through, 2023. It can take up until the next fall for that DCNR to say, okay, you're ready to go. You can start spending money, start your planning process. And then for us, we took approximately a year to do field work, do some research, come back. Oh, we need to look at this again. Coordinating with our research partners because everyone needed to do things at a different time of year. And so it was going out, doing research, and then bringing that data back. We did use a combination of in-house staff. I did a fair portion, but not all of the GIS for the final documents. And so we definitely had help too. I'll show some of that on the coming slide. And so winter 2024, so this is why I say it could be a 2.5-year process by the time that DCNR says, yes, okay, you've met all of our requirements for the plan, you're done, you're ready to go, let's get you put up in the Rivers Registry. And so I just want to have a realistic conversation with everyone and let you know. It is a little bit involved. The other thing is there's really one of two pathways that groups have done in our state for tackling rivers conservation plans. The first one is, just hire an engineering firm. So if you're a watershed group full of volunteers and you don't have a nonprofit you can partner with, or you have an engineering firm that's talking to you and saying, hey, would you like us to work in your area? Engineers know what these plans are. They know how to do the analysis and meet the requirements. But it does increase the cost of the plan because you're using paid professional volunteers. And so the second one is it's less work for you if you're the watershed group because you hand it off to the engineers and say, hey guys, go. But the second one, which is the approach that ALT took in the Conservation District, it sounds like they did the same for their 319 watershed assessment, I would make sure to say the right word there, is to have a strong coalition of partners. It reduces the cost of the plan, and it definitely did for us, but it involves more like direct one-on-one work. And so I had over 1,000 hours total towards this in the course of 2.5 years, as just an estimate. And so, Pennsylvania Fish and Boat, the Army Corps of Engineers, they have some programs where they can actually work with you and support you. But Fish and Boat needed a year's notice for us to request for them to do some fish assessment work in the stream. And on the timeline that I picked up the project, that just wasn't feasible. And so there are Army Corps programs and a couple of other groups where the state agencies may be able to help you, but they need a really long timeline of notice to get you into their work plan. So you have to take that into account. And then the other thing is public participation is required. DCNR requires 3 public meetings and is at a minimum, public input process. We did an online survey in addition to public meetings because 30 square miles, as Amy noted, it's a lot of area to cover. So we did a combination of things, and we still, wish we had reached more people, but it was great, and we very much enjoyed our outreach, but we did have to plan and know what we were trying to achieve with that outreach as well. A lot of it was just, tell me what's great about the creek. And they were like, oh yeah, there used to be, some beavers that lived over here, but then, that person built a house. And so the beavers went over here instead. And just really a lot of knowledge about, what the creek has been like over the years and how things are changing. So this was our coalition of not volunteers, but just our group that we had together. So we hired some consultants. They did the professional water quality testing for us. They only did a single sampling event, which isn't the best way to do water quality sampling, but it was sufficient for what we were looking for. Pashik did our public participation with some support from Allegheny Land Trust. So You know, I am not a certified planner, so I didn't feel comfortable necessarily leading that public participation process. So we did seek out a consultant. Western Pennsylvania Conservancy's Natural Heritage Program did a lot of the plant survey and special, you know, land communities work for us. And then Civic Mapper did a lot of major GIS support early on. And then I did the stylization of the maps at the end. So they really did a lot of background work and made sure that the GIS was working properly. And I frankly just made it pretty so that it fit into the plans. But we also had some university professors that were like, hey, we want to do a fish survey and it sounds like you've got a spot for us. So we worked with them and had some, you know, professional volunteers that worked with us in their off time or in their personal time, or in the case of the professors, they brought their classes out and did some of the work. So there is a way to do this, but again, it takes a lot more coordination. And as the project manager, making sure all these moving pieces were all moving forward together was also a major portion of the process. So again, just wanted to be realistic here. We had some interns doing, you know, municipal ordinance research. It was really comprehensive. This is on our website, but we'll share a link for Rebecca as well. I know we're getting close to time. So just like Amy mentioned, there is planning funding, and then there is some implementation funding that gets freed up when you have a plan in place. And so because not everything is covered under strict, you know, clean water or water quality rules, this may be able to free up some other funding available if, you know, the 319 or the Clean Water Act work isn't necessarily achieving your goals. And so that's why we wanted to differentiate between the two types of plans. There's also, you can actually use watershed plans as a support, and this is where Land Trust, you know, why is Land Trust doing a watershed plan? You know, we also looked at a lot of habitat conservation around, you know, things like the heron rookery, and said, where as a land conservation organization can we do more work to ensure that the cleanliness of the water in the watershed is as healthy as it can be. And so these plans do allow you and support acquisition projects and dollars as well. You can even, you know, apply for things like putting in river access points, informational signings. So if you just want to teach people more about the creek as a whole, or things you might encounter. So there's a lot of different types of funding. But just like my line in green at the bottom, you have to have the plan first before you can start accessing the funding. And, you know, rivers conservation is a specific program, so it has to be a rivers conservation plan to get those rivers conservation dollars. And so just wanted to kind of end it there. I know we're closer at time, so this is my contact information, but Rebecca will also share it, and I'm going to stop sharing so we can get to questions.
Thank you for that awesome information, Allison, Amy, and Annie. A lot of A's. I'm getting caught up. Thank you so much. So some of the questions have been addressed within the chat, and I just want to call some out that might be helpful to hear again and hear those that haven't directly been answered. So the webinar will be recorded, and we will send out a link in the follow-up email. And this will also be posted to ACCD's YouTube page. And you will also be able to find a link to that video through ACCD's website in our resources tab. And all of the links that were referenced here, whether within presentations, and also I took notes as you know, people were asking questions. So I will make sure to include everything we spoke about, including the presenter's contact information. And we do have an archive of all completed watershed plans within Allegheny County on the Conservation District website, and that will be a link that's included in the follow-up email. Let's see here. So Annie, this was after your presentation, and there's a question about including riparian zones or wildlife corridors within those plans. And I'm assuming that's something that can be incorporated if the people leading the plan would like that to be incorporated.
Yeah, there's lots of discussion going on about increasing the capabilities of our mapping and analysis, kind of like creating a regional database. There's actually a group effort happening right now through University of Pennsylvania via they're working on something called the Southwest PA Water Network. And that network has a branch of it that's discussing different data points and different analysis tools that allow us to map things like riparian buffers. Because right now, as you know, we have lots of great maps. Well, actually, if you talk to some people, even our maps of where a stream, the specific nature of a stream as it wiggles and moves throughout a watershed, is actually built with a couple of assumptions built into the GIS. And so even right now, there's efforts that they're working towards figuring out how to actually describe through contour delineation of the true stream channel, because then that allows them to be better at planning and understanding that channel. So I think those types of things are still in the works as one of the big things that we need in order to move forward with land use practices is to have really great aerial photos. Allegheny County is kind of next up for, I think it's called, if Civic Mapper was here, they'd be so good at making sure I knew my lingo, but I think it's like Q4, but to you, that's just like written jargon, right? But it's some kind of super amazing, stellar, amazing mapping that comes from the sky and a satellite that allows us to have an incredibly in-depth analysis of land use practices. This is necessary, for instance, right now PWSA is launching a stormwater fee. That type of analysis was used to determine property lines, to determine how much each person had to pay in the fee, right? So those types of things, then if us conservationists and our watershed people could get our hands on it, we can start doing the mapping for riparian buffers, which I totally agree. We should know how many feet off of a stream do we currently have forested, so that can be incorporated into our plans to make sure that we're trying to get a really good average across a stream, because as we know, riparian buffers are one of our best defenses against water quality issues.
Excellent. We have a question about working with local landowners as a private property owner. There is a Montour Run Watershed Association. I want to point that out, Jonathan. So there's a website, and I can share the contact. Do you know that offhand, Amy? It's president@merwa.info or .com. And you can also reach out to the Conservation District if there's a possibility to give guidance or lead you to different resources or contacts. We're certainly happy to do that, and love to see when a private property owner wants to steward the land as best they can. I will include a link to watershed groups, and Tolly with Power, thanks Tolly, called out watershed groups as well across Pennsylvania. If anybody's in need of a GIS map or CAD drafter, reach out to Derek. You can find him in the chat. We have a question about Pine Creek, and like I said, I'll connect that link to existing watershed plans, and there are several for the Pine Creek watershed. And we have a question about how the public participation surveys were conducted, Allison.
Yeah, I answered in the chat, so that's also part of the record. But we worked with Pashik to develop a SurveyMonkey electronic survey. But then recognizing that computer access is not the preference of everyone, we had paper copies available at our outreach events, and also let people kind of take them home from that event and mail them in later. And so that's how we did our public participation for the Big Sewickley Creek watershed study.
Great, so we have connections being made. And there's a question about organizing bioblitzes in the watershed. So I haven't done that personally. I'm not sure if there's if anybody's done bioblitzes around Allegheny County.
Well, no to the second half of your question, but yes, in Fayette and Westmoreland County, there is often an opportunity to do, I saw someone call it iNaturalist. It's my jam, right? So if you don't have that on your phone, you should. It's an app that allows you to not only document what you see, but also utilize photographic evidence of that to help identify the species. But we use that often with student groups because everyone loves their phones and then researching. So I don't know if they're actively happening in Allegheny County, but watershed groups, that's some of our bread and butter. So look up your local watershed group. They love to do that kind of thing.
Reach out to Tally if you have any work on access to rivers and creeks for non-motorized boaters. Her information is in the chat. And we have a question about who owns the stream.
That gets to be a complicated question. So if the stream is deemed a navigable waterway, which there are a list of those per DEP's definition of a navigable waterway, then the stream itself is owned by, I believe, the state. However, most of your local streams are identified as not navigable, and therefore they are owned by whoever the property owner is. So wherever those property boundary lines fall within the stream, that is who owns the stream.
Okay.
Last question, Rebecca.
Hi, I think stream owner, I don't want to jump in and say I'm not like a lawyer but I mean, stream ownership can be a little bit complicated, right? I think if there's a property owner that owns property on both sides of the stream, then you can float down it, but you can't like anchor or put your foot down, you know, so it's a little bit complicated, and it is an issue of whether or not you can put your foot or an anchor in the water. But as long as you can float a boat down in the water, no one can really stop you from doing that. I don't know if that's kind of what you were saying, Amy.
Yeah, thanks, Tally. For anybody that doesn't know Tally, she works with Power.
I don't even know the name of my own organization. So I typed it wrong.
Rebecca,
so yeah, thanks for that.
I saw a question about flow come through, and I just want to say that one of the best resources for that is I didn't even put them in my PowerPoint. See, look at me forgetting even the silos of the silos, right? So the USGS is the one that handles a lot of our flow data, because they have they have these really incredible monitors. They're sparsely placed, but they do exist, and they allow you to understand how much quantity. So they do have some quality ones as well, where they're looking at what the stream dynamic is based on its water quality outcomes. But the USGS has really great mapping software to understand quantity, which I assume is what you mean by flow. It's not going to be on your small streams. I think, for instance, there's one on the Yaak. There's maybe a couple on our main river stems. I believe there's one on Pine Creek. I think, or that one is a research-based station because they're doing some brand new technologies there, something along those lines. And it might be Gertie's Run. So there's a couple tributaries that have the blessing of a USGS stream flow gauge, but a lot of groups have had to engineer those. So smaller watershed groups like Jacobs Creek, for instance, we had data loggers, and they help us understand flow. They're small little instruments that you can temporarily put in your stream to understand some tiny parameters of quality, but also sometimes get that flow data, but they're kind of finicky and lead to a lot of trauma for those that have to manage them, but they do exist. And so local watershed groups will let you know where those monitors might be. And then there's a larger group called Three Rivers Quest. I think I said that right, because there's a couple. I have to get my own organization and other organizations not confused, but it's out of West Virginia University, and they collect a lot of that data monitoring data for flow. So you should go to their website. That's a resource for finding out if a data logger might be somewhere you're interested.
Back to BioBlitzes, keep your eyes peeled. Pittsburgh Parks Conservancy completes BioBlitzes, so keep a lookout. Maybe there's something for spring. We are not affiliated with the Stroud Research Center, but gosh, what a great resource, and definitely recommend for any of you that aren't familiar to check out their website. They have a lot of educational resources and tips. Okay, so last call for questions. We're past our hour. Thank you so much to the speakers. So informative, so grateful to have people who've been through this be able to share. Thank you to everybody who came tonight. It's impressive. Watershed plans are so important, and we're glad to see you all here. We hope you learned something, and we'll follow up with resources. And I think that's it. So look for an email from us. Thanks for the lift from power, Tolly. Thanks for checking in. And yeah, thank you. Reach out if you need anything.
Thank you, everyone. Have a nice night.